Hi there, Jane. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Dave Tyler. It's great to talk with you. And I think we should all give Jane a round of applause for that tremendous film. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you for watching it. Good to see you. I'm like, I can see like myself on the screen. It's pretty trippy.
Well, I know you're getting the whole angle, hopefully, of the whole angle of the theater as well. So thanks so much for being here. Tell us, let's start by asking you where you got the idea for this film.
Sure. It's when you make your first film and when you make your first film in the way that I did, which was sort of a concerted effort to make it on my own terms and with and by proxy of that, without a lot of resources, it was really this sort of like, all right, if you can only make one film in your life, which thankfully won't be the case, I will make other films. But when you go into your first film and you're thinking about like what you can make and the resources that you're likely to have, it's such a delicate question because you need to come up with an idea for something that is, obviously like you are willing to spend years of your life working on and that you care about deeply and that's incredibly personal, but you also need to think realistically about what you're going to be able to afford and how to be restrained. I think is something that's very important for a young filmmaker, right? How to not sort of like reach for the stars and do too much and try to make your grand opus right out of the gate. And so all that to say, like, when I sort of zeroed in on this idea that I found myself obsessed with of making a film about sort of like inspired by memories of growing up online and my internet is a different internet than the current internet or the internet of my youth, that is. And it's a different internet than the internet in the film, but to make something inspired by like a large part of my childhood experience and a lot of where like, I think I sort of came of age and found myself or went looking for myself, which was sort of like in the glow of that screen, after hours in my parents' basement. It just seemed like such a perfect way to do both things, way to make something that's like incredibly personal and true to me, but that also is it's such a chamber piece in a lot of ways. It both is and isn't a chamber piece in a lot of ways, because in one sense this is a film of two people alone in two different rooms, and in another sense it's a film that really disappears into screens and sort of like traverses this digital space in a much less claustrophobic way. But yeah, it was I read it. I was a little old for creepypasta, which if you're not familiar with that term, is the term for this community of people online. And it was sort of at its peak, I'd say around like 2009 to 2014 on places like Reddit and other internet forums and on YouTube, these platforms where people would essentially tell each other scary stories and pretend that they were actually existing in these scary stories. And in any number of formats, from video to audio to picture to written text. But basically like the internet's version of ghost stories or campfire tales or urban legends that, because of the way the internet works, were very participatory, meaning that it wasn't just one person telling everyone a story. It was sort of like a mic being passed around from person to person. When I read about that and when I sort of like discovered that community, which if I had been a teenager at the time would have been my whole life, it really brought me back to being a kid online and sort of like looking at scary things after bed and just sort of like trying to find something beautiful in these sort of like darker spaces on the internet.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned the personal nature of this. What games were you playing in your parents' basement, and how did that feed into this film?
What games was I playing in my parents' basement? Jazz ball, I guess. Just like like N64. I didn't really play like I didn't participate in like RPGs or MMORPGs, like that being the term for like this sort of game that flirts with reality, right? Like maybe I played like a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, but I never really messed with that. What I did do was write a lot of like scary stories and like fan fiction-y type stuff. Like my message board of like my youth, the sort of equivalent in my early years to what Casey is getting into in the film, was a message board like an internet forum for the movie Scream. I was like a huge fan of those movies when I was like 13
Oh,
years
sure.
old.
Yeah.
It was there was like a section of that site for people to sort of like write their own scripts and stories. And yeah, you know, I was like 13 years old and I would be like writing these like these scripts and making up these scary stories. And the way it worked on this message board was that you would sort of like make the characters in your story the different characters from the message board, like the people's usernames and personalities, like everyone would fuse into each other's stories. So it was in a way this like this thing that I'm fascinated by on the internet of like blending the fictional and the real, you know, the personal and this and the fantasy. And yeah, it was I definitely had some like strange, intimate but not intimate relationships with just like older people from that space. There's this idea, you know, and I never talked about it. I never mentioned it to anyone in my real life that was like a life I was living after bedtime, which I think is like is very much a part of this film and very much like a part of being young on the internet is the ways in which it can feel both real and totally unreal, you know, and it's so easy to compartmentalize like an online life from a real life. And I think that's a lot of what this film is interested in is the ways in which that space can enable identity play or expression or creativity or, you know, something darker. And the ways in which that can both feel like incredibly intimate and totally just like not real because it's contained in that glowing box that's contained in your basement.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more because so much of the film is about where that line ends, where the end of that screen is for both of the main participants in the film. Were you making conscious decisions about just how much of that life was bleeding off the screen for these characters?
Oh yeah, the film is like I think like quite obsessive in its structure, very formalist in its way, and very like a thing that I was very concerned with while developing the movie were sort of what I would think of as like the margins of the film, like what the camera was allowed access to in these people's lives, and so much of like the creative intention of the film was to really make something that felt like honest to this strangeness of the internet and the strangeness of what I was just talking about, those relationships that are both incredibly intimate, but then also like, you know, you fall out of touch with someone and you realize maybe you didn't even know their real first name. You know, I really wanted the film in a lot of ways to feel like this merging of like a language of the internet and a language of film. But in its emotions and in the way that we're relating to the characters and the sort of like central tensions in the movie, I really wanted the same thing as well. I wanted it to feel really true to how like ambivalent a lot of these online relationships and communications can be. And so the rule, like broadly speaking, that I set for myself is that we wouldn't really know much about these characters outside of what they would know about each other, right? Like we understand that like this is a character named Casey, but then by the end of the film, we're even left to question whether that was this person's real name. We don't really know where she lives. We don't know what her home life is like beyond just like the briefest hints that maybe there is like a distance between her and her father, which she of course alludes to in her videos. We see this gun, but we don't, you know, then we hear her bring it up. So we know it's really there, but we don't know intention. And I think that that's a very core part of the internet. There's this idea that's like sort of like a popular internet adage called Poe's Law, which the stuffed animal in the movie is named after. And Poe's Law is the idea that it can be impossible online to tell if someone is telling you the truth or trolling you. And this is really taken to maybe it's like existential extremes in the film. And for you're right for him as well, for the JLB character, there's so much left unspoken there. And you know, a lot of these relationships that I had when I was a younger person online, you look back at them and they can feel deeply predatory and to the point where it's like, of course, when the word pedophile comes at the end of the film in that message that Casey sends to JLB, it's like that word had to have been in his head at some point. This person, like, no one is like ignorant to the dynamic of like, oh, you're like a middle-aged man talking to like what seems to be a pretty young teenager online. But it's just a question of like, what is the intention there, right? Like, and that's something that the film is quite interested in, but less interested in giving you a firm answer on, because I think it's much more interesting to like sort of immerse the audience in that ambiguity, because to me, again, it is the ambiguity that feels truthful to the experience of the internet.
I was going to say that, and I had a question queued up about JLB because I'm still not entirely sure what his deal is, and I was wondering if he was sitting in the room of a dead child.
Is JLB sitting in the room of a dead child? No.
No. Okay. All right.
No. But that's not the first time I've heard that theory. That's the first time I've said no. I enjoy all theories. That wasn't the intention. That wasn't the intention.
Forget I said it.
No, please. I almost feel bad for saying no, but that, yeah.
Well, you talked about the ambiguity of the people. I want to touch a little bit on the ambiguity of the game as well, because here we are with a movie where the game is in the title, and we have so many references to the game and to what happens in the game and what happens outside of the game. And aside from that, I'll call it the Activision clip of the game in 1994, we don't really see it. And I'll confess, like, in other movies, the game or the internet, it becomes the big bad, the thing that is going to jump out and scare you. And at some points when the refresh wheel was going, I was expecting to see another clown somewhere, come to life. But here we're not doing that here. And it seemed like another conscious choice on your part to make the people the focus and what's going on inside them, rather than what's going on inside the game.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. I'm fascinated by this form. I'm fascinated by the form mainly, I think, as an artist who recognizes like something of themselves in the desire to participate in something like this. And I'm also like fascinated by it as someone who's like kind of came to it a little bit late, right? Like I heard about the creepypasta community in 2014, and I just like Googling a lot about like the Slender Man. The experience of like starting to wrap your head around what one of these things is a very strange process. Like, because like a lot of things on the internet, it's not non-linear. Maybe you like hear about, this like some like, oh, have you heard of the Slender Man? You go home, you're like, what was that? You Google it. And like very quickly you're watching lots of different people's videos, and they're all sort of like spinning their own angle on it, and it's like this sort of like open source mythology that if something takes off, and a lot of these often do, they become incredibly convoluted. And maybe like you can eventually find like a Wikipedia page or something that gives you the linear history of it. And I did write a Wikipedia page linear history for the fake game within the film so that I understood it. But I really wanted to capture in the film I wanted it to feel a little bit frustrating, like, and it's certainly that's Casey's experience with it, is like, she's heard of this beforehand. There's this like very simple challenge that you take that's pretty broad at the beginning of the film. And then so much of like the video content that she watches and then that we watch during the film, it's almost overwhelming, right? And JLB specifically says that, right? Like this can be very confusing at first. There's a lot of lore out there. I really wanted to create that feeling in the viewer of being like overwhelmed and feeling like the film is only scratching the surface of like a pretty convoluted and like schizophrenic, in that it's speaking from a lot of different personalities and voices who are all trying to take it in all of these different directions. I really wanted that to be the feeling of it, because to me, the heart of the film emotionally is this like war or battle of wills or power struggle that's going on between Casey and JLB. Each of them is trying to express a narrative. And that's really what happens in these games, right? Like people sort of like use it to express a narrative that they're interested in. And what starts to happen is that like there almost becomes this like battle for dominance of the narrative between the two of them, right? Like JLB is trying to sort of control Casey's journey, and Casey is almost like fighting back against that through her videos, all while they're playing out this like very intimate relationship.
You really start. Oh, I was
I'm
just
sorry,
gonna
go
say,
ahead.
you really start to feel that in the tarot card scene.
That's right.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, what else can I tell you about the mythology? I think the other thing that really appealed to me about it is that this idea and it's based on a lot of different creepypastas, or I'm like kind of pulling elements from a lot of them. But the idea that you do this ritual and then something happens, it's really like about as broad as that. And that was really important, I think, for what I wanted to express with the film, because of course it's so broad specifically, and that's like a lot of the appeal of these things, is that it allows people to sort of play it however they want to play it, right? And for Casey, it's like, all right, you did this ritual, now something is going to happen, maybe you're going to change in some way. By seeing the way in which she wants to express a change or perform a change, perhaps that tells us something about her desires or fears or anger, right? It's like, what is there hiding in not in the game itself, but in her relationship to it and the way she plays it.
Right. Speaking of the way she plays it, Anna was fabulous, and it's hard to believe that that this was her first film. I understand from reading that she's got some other things lined up already. But what was it like working with her, and how quickly did she kind of embrace the material?
And it was incredible. I was like dead set on not making this movie until we had found somebody who was like a once in a lifetime incredible discovery. And that takes a lot of work. We looked for months and months and thousands upon thousands of teenagers, and a lot of professional actors, a lot of total non-actors. And Anna was the best of both worlds. Like, Anna is somebody who hadn't done a lot of professional acting, but who wanted deeply to be an actor and was just phenomenally talented. From the first reading, you could tell that she could anchor a scene the way that she does in this film. But she's also so herself, and so singular, and so fascinating, and watchable in a way that what you find when you look at a large number of teen actors who are more professional is that like a lot of their idiosyncrasies have been sanded down, right? And they like, just like a lot of teen actors sort of like feel like the CW version of a teenager, for lack of a better term. And that was like, so if that's what we had in this film, the film just wouldn't work, right? Like, one of the magic tricks of the film is that you really do feel like you're peering into this person's bedroom, like a real person. And yeah, I mean, we were so lucky to find Anna, and we were also so lucky because Anna was just the most generous, warm, intuitive, brilliant collaborator. Like, we worked for months in the lead up to making the movie. We found her in October and we shot in April of 2019. And in 2020. We shot in April of 2020, found her in October 2019. And I'm sorry, not April, February. What am I doing here? What is time? COVID. We had about 4 months of prep, and so much of that prep was getting on the same page about this very complex character. Like, a lot of it was running scenes and doing improv exercises and literally choreographing. Like, so many of the scenes in the movie that are nonverbal and these long takes, like we'd choreographed like every movement of the face, like she knew it by heart by the time we got out there. But I think the most important part of prep was getting on the same page, like, so that she could really understand and find the character. She's a very different person than Casey. There's a lot of her in Casey, but she's a very different person than Casey. And she actually says it in the tape she sent in. I was just watching it recently, like her initial self-tape that she made for us. She says this beautiful thing that we talked about a ton while making the movie, which was she said that she thinks that like every person is a lot of different people, depending on their mood or their day or what they're doing or interacting with at any given moment, that like people are puzzles in this way. And so she came to the role like understanding what the intention was, which is that like we never quite see Casey. We never have Casey explained to us in this movie. And a lot of her behavior in the film is almost intentionally contradictory. Like the character is intentionally trying to sort of fool us or troll us in certain ways, or just like maintain some kind of power over us through these videos and these performances. But to find like the sort of like innermost core of what was driving that character was a lot of the prep work that we did together, and just talking about like just the key questions that it took a while for Anna to really understand was like, what is Casey looking for in this? And like, why would Casey be drawn to scary things? Anna doesn't like horror movies. You know, she like really like, it took a while to understand like, why would this person want this?
Right. Well, and that's another question here is there's a lot of loneliness in this film, right? And so was one of the reasons we can assume the character wants some of this is attention and things like that. But was there that you talked a little bit about the connection of these online communities, but the film kind of shows us that also only goes so far, you know, in terms of the loneliness that people feel. Do you think that's something we're all still grappling with today, especially as we see headlines about, you know, various conspiracy theories out there that people are latching onto? There's a lot of power in the statements about loneliness, I thought.
Yeah, the movie is definitely like, I think, very interested in the good and maybe more troubling aspects of the internet, right? And the ways in which like truth and fiction can be collapsed on top of themselves on our current internet is something that the film is very interested in. I will say that to me, it's a film. You know, a lot of what the film is talking about, I think is maybe most productively gleaned through a queer lens. And that's not to say that like this is a coming out story or about an explicitly queer character, but certainly for me, what I was looking for in those online spaces as a kid was something that like I wasn't getting in daylight, right? And a lot of, I think like when you look at a lot of like darker edged subcultures or subcultures that like other, you know, like more normative people might look at and be horrified by, like goth subcultures, metal subcultures, horror subcultures, you know, you find it can be a place for people who, again, just like aren't comfortable in the daylight. You know, they go looking for things and maybe even find something beautiful in darker tones. And certainly this character is like not comfortable in her own skin, in her own daily life. And this sort of desire to sort of like express herself or gain some sort of control over her identity through this performance online. Yeah, I think that it's like it's very much like the story of a young artist, and it's very much the story of like a young person dealing with trying to find an identity that feels truthful to them.
You made a documentary on internet mythology. Did you know after you made that you were going to go right into something like this, or did that inform your decision making?
The documentary actually started as a function of this. I was really fascinated by, I had already sort of like settled on the idea of making a narrative film sort of set in this emotional universe. And I was just doing, like I said, a ton of research into the creepypasta community and into this sort of like, the documentary I think is more overtly political and more about this sort of like snake eating its own tail, truth becoming fiction and fiction becoming truth again, sort of QAnon of it all. Although made before QAnon was really a thing. And I was really just like sort of like doing research and looking for visual references and thematic references, just like falling deep down the rabbit hole that you can fall down online, and started sort of like putting those visual references together into a certain form, and it just became its own project kind of. But naturally I sort of realized that the best way to talk about this sort of like content cycle of YouTube, which is grotesque and totally insane, was to make a documentary completely out of archival and completely out of like what I would call like first person sources, right? Like only YouTube videos. And so it sort of became a fun, not side project, but project that I was working on while I was continuing to think about like what this film World's Fair could eventually be.
And at the outset here, you talked about not wanting to make your magnum opus, but there's a whole variety of techniques and shots. We get that long 8-minute shot at the open. We get all this found footage feel. So you're certainly reaching into a bag of tricks, but it almost feels like this movie couldn't have been made any other way. Like, did it feel that way to you as you were putting it together, or was
Definitely.
that? Yeah.
And like I said, that was the intention from the very beginning, right? Like I hope to make another film in this budget range someday, because I think it's really fun. I'm working on a much bigger film now, and there's a lot that you can't do with like a bigger crew and more money and more rules and all of that. There were days on this shoot where it was like 5 of us, and we were filming on photo booth on my old laptop. There's something about that nimbleness and that sort of like DIY aesthetic that I find really beautiful and just a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. This was a lot of fun to make. And yeah, the movie was definitely like, what I'm proud of is that the movie, like you said, couldn't have been made any other way. The form fits the sort of narrative of the film, and it wasn't like, oh, let's film it on a cell phone because we can't do anything else. It was like, this is a movie about a certain feeling and a certain part of existence, and the best way to make it is in this sort of lo-fi way. Homemade is the word I would use.
Well, and the form really pulls you along right down to the refresh wheel, where it almost becomes a character in the movie at a certain point. You're waiting for what's next to pop out, so it really does pull you along. We're running about out of time here, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, and really enjoyed all this. It's been a busy year for you. You started at Sundance, and I understand you've been picked up by HBO as well. Can you tell us a little bit about where we might see you next and where we might see the film next?
For sure. So the film will be in theaters across the country in April via Utopia Pictures, and then later, I think 3 months later, so early summer, it'll be on HBO Max streaming, which is very exciting. And yeah, I'm in pre-production on my next film, which I'm doing with A24 and Emma Stone and Dave McCarey's production company. It's a movie called I Saw the TV Glow, about similar things, but in a different way. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's really fun to get to, like, we're like making monsters and stuff for the next one, so it'll be a lot bigger. And yeah, it's like a whole different sandbox. So look for that one. I think we're going to shoot it next year, so the year after that.
Okay, great. Well, Jane, thank you again so much. We really enjoyed it here, having you here and being able to share this movie with you. So thanks for sharing it with us.
Thanks so much. Take care, y'all.